In this forest in the Baltic country of Latvia, one of the worst atrocities of the Second World War took place. In the winter of 1941, over 24,000 Latvian Jews were marched out of their houses and homes, stripped of their belongings and then their clothes, lined up in their dozens atop vast trenches, and shot twice in the head. Any that did not fall into the ditches were pushed down by so-called kickers.
Tas šausmas bija tik briesmīgas, ka viss tas šķita nereāli. Tas jau nemaz nevar būt. Tas ir tikai tā kā tāda filma, kā tāds sapnis.
Though they didn't actually pull the triggers, it was Latvians who did the rounding up, the stripping, the marching of the Jews to their deaths, and the kicking of them into their graves. Led by this man, Viktors Arājs, the Arajs Kommando were responsible for many more atrocities during the war.
We can directly attribute approximately 26,000 deaths directly to the Arajs Kommando.
But what drove Viktors Arājs and his men to kill their own people? Were they coerced, deluded by the Nazis? Or were they just plain evil? This is the uncomfortable truth about Latvia's most brutal and vicious Nazi collaborators. The Arajs Kommando. Latvia had been part of the Russian Empire for almost 200 years. But in 1918, its people were set free. The proud new independent Latvia wore its heart on its sleeve. Its people were deeply nationalistic and fiercely protective of their newfound freedom. In 1934, former Prime Minister Kārlis Ulmanis, inspired by Mussolini, portrayed himself as the great protector of Latvia's independence. In May, he garnered the support of the Latvian army and marched on the capital, Riga. In a bloodless coup, Ulmanis took control of the country and declared himself president. One who shared that passion was 24-year-old Viktors Arājs, the son of a blacksmith. He'd left university and joined the Latvian police in support of the new regime. Ulmanis was immensely popular, and the country flourished under him. But beneath the populist wrapping was a repressive government. Censorship was key to the Ulmanis dogma, so the press was gagged and political parties banned, though Latvia was certainly not anti-Semitic. By the 1930s, Jews and other minorities had been stripped of their human rights, persecuted and imprisoned in Nazi Germany. Most had no option but to put up and shut up. Some preferred to leave. The only problem was that the rest of Europe was unwilling to take them. Latvia was the exception. It became a safe haven for the Jews and other minorities fleeing Nazi Germany. But in their new home, under a strict news blackout, they had no newspapers or radio and almost no idea that a war had started. The Jewish population had reached about 90,000, when in 1940, Latvia's world fell apart. Latvia had been free of the Soviet Union for just 22 years. Now their former oppressors who had ruled them for 200 years were back. Stalin had cut a deal with Hitler to carve up Eastern Europe. Hitler got most of Poland. Stalin got the Baltic states, including Latvia. For people like Viktors Arājs, it was a catastrophe. The occupiers swiftly imposed a regime of terror. Over 35,000 Latvians were deported to work in Soviet labor camps known as gulags. They were the lucky ones. Thousands more were murdered and buried in mass graves. But less than a year after their historic deal, Hitler double-crossed Stalin. Germany declared war on the Soviet Union, and on the 22nd of June 1941, invaded. The Baltic states, including Latvia, stood between Hitler's armies and Moscow. The Germans crossed the Lithuanian border and with lightning speed reached Latvia's frontier the next day. They reached Riga, the capital, by the end of the same week. What little pro-Soviet resistance there was put up a stern fight, but there were no match for the strength or size of the German army, and was soon overwhelmed. As the German army entered Riga on the 1st of July, they were greeted by delirious crowds, free at last from the brutality of the Soviet regime. Rather than being detested as invaders, the Germans were welcomed as liberators. Even Jews waved their red and white Latvian flags, among them the Latvian Jewish Vestamanis family. They would soon discover the Nazis' real intentions.
Tie, kas bija gaidījušas vāciešus, protams, viņus apsveic ar puķiem un tā tālāk. Rīgas radiofona stacija, kas bija klusējusi cīņu dienās ap Rīgu, pēkšņi atdzīvojās, atskanēja Latvijas valsts himna, un diktors latviski uzrunāja radioklausītājus. Sagaidiet mūsu vācu armijas atbrīvotājus, tie atbrīvots mūs no komunistu bolševika jūga, un beidza ar uzsaukumu sitiet žīdus un komunistus. Tā jau mums ļāva nojaust, ka mēs esam lemti lielai traģēdijai.
Among the invasion forces was Walter Stahlecker, a former civil servant. He reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. Stahlecker's men began spreading rumors that all Latvian Jews were communists, and it was they who were responsible for the atrocities during Soviet occupation. They even disinterred corpses of victims of the communists and accused the Jews of their death. The very first edition of the Nazi newspaper Tavia wrote, "The Jewish-led Bolsheviks are thieves and murderers." Those words were seen by the 31-year-old Latvian police officer, Viktors Arājs. Arājs had been at school with Walter Stahlecker's official translator and saw an opportunity to further his career.
I think Arajs was personally a very ambitious man. He sought to align himself with existing power structures. We saw this in wanting to be a police officer in Riga in a special unit, joining prestigious student fraternity, and in the early days of July, most faithfully aligning himself with the Nazis.
Stahlecker saw Arajs as a willing collaborator and asked him to form an auxiliary police group to help his men round up Jews. Within days, an advert appeared in the newspaper Tavija, calling all patriotic Latvians, students, officers, militiamen and citizens who are ready to actively take part in the cleansing of our country of undesirable elements. The group was even named after Viktors Arājs. It was the Arajs Kommando. About 100 applied, among them Arajs, a Latvian aviation pioneer. He became Arajs' right-hand man. At the very start of the occupation, Riga and its people were calm.
Nebija nekādu spontānu akciju, kāda tur, kad kādiem ebrejiem vai kādiem kreisiem strādniekam kāds tur uzbrukt, viss bija samērā mierīgi. Bet tur nebija būtībā tikpat kā nekāda pretebreju pasākumu paredzēta. Vienīgais, kas bija, ka ebrejiem bija aizliegt stāvēt rindās pie veikaliem.
Soon, anti-Semitic propaganda appeared on the streets. Jews were required to display 2 yellow stars of David stitched to the front and back of their clothes. Then the Arajs Kommando's reign of terror began. All telephone lines were cut, and the Arajs Kommando went on the rampage in downtown Riga.
Bet naktī parādījās apbruņoti cilvēki, tie saucamie latviešu pašaizsardzība, apbruņoti ar sarkanbēlu sarkanām lentēm, kuri lauzās ebreju dzīvokļus, itin kā policija, nekādas jau ieroči jau nemeklēja, sāka laupīt un piekaut. No mūsu ģimenes
The Arajs Kommando stirred up anti-Jewish riots, pogroms. Almost all places of Jewish worship were ransacked. On the 4th of July, the Arajs Kommando slammed shut the doors of the Great Choral Synagogue on Gogol Street and set the building alight. This is all that remains of the synagogue today. Some reported that Jews were herded into the building beforehand, others that the synagogue was full of Lithuanian refugees. Eyewitnesses placed Viktors Arājs and Herbert Sukers personally at the scene. There were 300 inside. All perished in the flames. While Riga burned, the next target was to eliminate Jews in the rest of the country. Liepāja, Latvia's second largest port, was a cosmopolitan city with a vibrant Jewish community. The German army were followed into the city by a squad of Walter Stahlecker's men, an Einsatzgruppe. There were 4 such squads spread over Eastern Europe. Their task, to eradicate all enemies of Germany. Einsatzgruppe A was assigned to the Baltic states. It was considered the most murderous. They immediately began interrogating Liepāja citizens and randomly shooting Jews on the street. A week later, Walter Steilacker ordered them to speed up the killing. So they turned to Latvian collaborators, like the Arajs Kommando. On the 8th of July, those collaborators rounded up as many Jews as they could find, loaded them onto trucks, and drove them to this beach, where the Nazi hit squad was waiting. Reinhard Wiener, a German sailor, was on shore leave. He was a witness to what happened next.
Dort waren ringsherum deutsche Soldaten. Zunächst, ich stellte mich dann hin in der zweiten Reihe von den Soldaten auf, in einem Abstand von etwa 50 Metern vom Graben entfernt und wartete nun, was geschieht.
Wiener had with him a cine camera and began to film what he saw.
Es dauerte gar nicht lange, kam ein Lastwagen angefahren, ein Pritschenwagen mit Menschen drauf.
The Jews were driven to the beach and guarded by Latvians.
Und an allen 4 Ecken dieser Pritsche standen Zivilisten mit gelben Armbinden und einem mit Gewehr. Sondern haben da irgendetwas gerufen, was ich nicht verstand. Und daraufhin sprangen nachher die Menschen auf und ich sah, dass sie gelbe Lappen, gelbe Flicken vorn und hinten und auf dem Rücken, auf der Brust und auf dem Rücken hatten.
But the unloading process was not the end of the Latvian Guard's duties.
Und die wurden nachher von den anderen aufgefangen und dann mussten sie erstmal in Reihe antreten und wurden dann nachher auf den Graben zugejagt, getrieben. Und das war von der SS und lettischen Heimwehr, die das gemacht haben. Dann mussten sie in den Graben reinspringen und den Graben entlanglaufen bis ans Ende.
Wiener then moved his camera closer to the trench.
Mussten sich mit dem Rücken zum Exekutionskommando stellen. Also sie wussten ja im Moment, als sie den Graben gesehen haben, werden sie vielleicht gewusst haben, was mit ihnen geschieht. Und werden auch gefühlt haben, weil unten bereits eine Schicht Toter lag, auf die nur eine dünne Sandschicht geschaufelt wurde. Das Exekutionskommando stand von hinten und dann bekam das Exekutionskommando den Befehl, nach vorzutreten und dann den Schießbefehl. Sie wurden also von hinten erschossen. Ich hatte so den Eindruck, dass sie nur erschossen wurden, weil sie Juden waren.
It is thought up to 300 were killed on this day, but Steilacker was far from satisfied. Over the next few days, 900 more were shot. It was the first sign that Latvians like the Arajs Kommando were willing not just to collaborate with the Nazis, but also to participate in the mass extermination of the Jews. With this phase of the operation complete, attention returned to Riga. While it looks like any quiet, clean suburb of Riga, these streets once formed the boundary of what was the Riga Ghetto of 1941. Just as in Poland and other Nazi-occupied countries, Latvian Jews were relocated into a ghetto. Concentrating Jews in city ghettos like this granted the Nazis more time to work out exactly how they were going to kill them. The Moscow Quarter, on the banks of the river Daugava, was an area of 16 blocks and was chosen for its poor housing and sanitation. On the 23rd of October, the Jews of Riga were ordered to leave their homes and report for transfer to the ghetto.
Visu to iedzīvu, kas tika atļauta, jau stāvēja un skatījās, ko drīkst ņemt līdzi un ko nedrīkst ņemt līdzi, ja nu ļoti maz. Tikai pašu nepieciešamāko, to tad uz stumjamiem ratiņiem tad stūma uz to geto rajonu.
The empty homes left behind by the Jews were ransacked, first by the Nazis to send goods and furniture back to Germany, and then by the Latvian police as payment for their collaboration. When the ghetto was sealed in mid-October 1941, there were almost 30,000 inside. The perimeter was secured with barbed wire and guarded by Latvian police. Anyone who approached the wire was shot. Riga's Jews were now exactly where the Nazis wanted them. Inside the ghetto, they were hounded constantly by the likes of the Arajs Kommando, who would beat the Jews by day and steal from them by night. Meager rations left the Jews feeling desperately hungry.
Tā saspiestība geto jau bija briesmīga. Arī latviešu pārtikas devis jau bija pietiekoši mazas, bet šeit vēl bija puse. Kaut kāda maize tur deva, jā, tur 250 gramu dienā paredzēti. Un gaļas vietā tur kādas siļķu galvas, jau pūstoši kāposti, bet cilvēki, kuriem vēl bija kaut kāda pārtika, kaut kādas konserves paņemtas līdz, baidījās to ēst, jo vēl jau būs ziema. Visi jau gatavojas, ka tas geto vēl eksistēs kādu laiku.
But after just 5 weeks in the ghetto, before dawn on the 30th of November, hundreds of drunken Arajs Kommando kicked down the ghetto gate and stormed inside.
They barged into the ghetto 4 a.m. and began hauling people out onto the street and setting them in columns of 1,000 people each. And the Jews were told that they were being relocated for labor.
In the initial terrifying storming of the ghetto, 1,000 Jews died.
Un dažkārt uz tiem, kas mēģināja apsēsties ceļa malā, turpat šāva, vai vienkārši šāva, vienkārši pūlī. Un cilvēki mēģināja, vecāki cilvēki, bērni mēģināja apsēsties. Tad pirmoreiz parādījās, lūk, šie Arajs Kommando. Jā, parādījās pirmoreiz, cilvēki jau atpazina viņu cukurs. Un tad ap pusdienas laiku, ap 1, tad viņi sāka dzīt prom. Un uz Ludzas ielas palika 10 un 10 līķu, bērni un veci cilvēki.
"12,000 were now escorted out of the ghetto by German soldiers and Latvian police. At first it wasn't clear what had become of them. But rumors spread fast that the Nazis had murdered everyone.
Bet mēs vēl neticējām. Un vācieši vēl mēģināja arī uzturēt šo cerību, jā. Izplatīja zīmītes, rakstīts idišā, kaut kādam Ābramam, kaut kādam Haimam, kaut kādam, nezinu, kur viņš ir palicis, jā. Dažkārt pat ar uzvārdiem, ka mēs esam nometnē Salaspilī. Tur ir nometnes, un tur sievietes mazgā vēļu, un veci cilvēki pieskata bērnus.
The 12,000 had been marched out of the ghetto, but they had not been taken to concentration camps. In fact, they'd been handed over to this man, Lieutenant General Friedrich Jeckeln. Jeckeln had developed a system for packing bodies in mass graves by lining them up like sardines in a tin before being shot. He called it sardine packing. Jeckeln had perfected his system at a place called Babi Yar, where he'd sardine-packed 33,000 Jews. He'd been summoned to Berlin, where Heinrich Himmler, chief architect of the Holocaust, had commanded him to rid the Baltic states of every Jew. The 12,000 Jews of the Riga ghetto had been sardine-packed. Jeckeln had traveled to Latvia to plan the crime meticulously. First, he'd found the location, Rumbula, a forest 10 kilometers from the ghetto. It was close to the main road out of the city and had loose, sandy soil. He had 3 pits dug by Russian prisoners of war, and then he'd hand-picked a murderous gang of Germans. There were just 12. He knew them all personally and included his driver and his bodyguard. But how could just 12 men murder thousands of Jews? Jeckeln would need help with the logistics. So he chose Viktors Arājs, Herbert Sukers, and the Arajs Kommando.
The participation of a large number of Latvian auxiliaries was necessary to carry it off. That can't be denied. The Germans didn't have the manpower to do it by themselves.
The Arajs Kommando's ranks had now swollen to over 1,000. Students, builders, policemen, even one accountant had volunteered to join the gang. Most were under 30 years old. Some were anti-communist, some anti-Semitic. Others were attracted by the excellent wages. Now they were to become collaborators in the most heinous of war crimes. The roundup in the ghetto was still fresh in everyone's minds. And the Vestamanis family sensed the time was running out.
Naktī mēs dzirdam, kā tēvs runā ar māti čukstus. Tēvs saka mātei, Roza, mums ir jāaiziet idišā. Un dafā vegēn. Jāaiziet no dzīves. Jaunie, varbūt vēl kāda izēja ir, bet te jau nekas nebūs. Viņam jau bija tikai 60 gadi. Un māte raud un saka, nē. Nu, viņam bija inde. Gribēja aiziet no dzīves. Viņš saprata, ka nekas vairs tur nebūs. Māte rauda un saka, un atkārto jau histeriski saka, nē. A to glebam ir žehlebam. Viena dzīves diena, dzīvot vienu dienu, arī tā ir dzīve. Kaut vai vienu dienu vēl.
Any thoughts that the friends they'd seen taken from the ghetto were still alive were banished a week later. Because on the 8th of December 1941, the Arajs Kommando came back. Once again, Jews were lined up in columns of 1,000, including, this time, the mother, sister, and older brother of Margas Vestamanis. The Arajs Kommando then marched them out of the city.
They served in the indispensable role of providing the cordon. In other words, clear the ghetto out, get the Jews set on their march towards Rumbula, make sure they don't escape. That is an absolutely vital, crucial, pivotal role. Without them, it couldn't have been carried off.
As the columns reached Rumbula, even more Arajs Kommando, drunk on vodka, forced the Jews to strip and abandon their luggage. They then kicked them and punched them towards the trenches. The 12 German marksmen worked in shifts. Roughly 16 were killed every minute. While Jekeln gave orders from the head of the trenches, the Arajs Kommando organized the huge conveyor belt of victims. 12,000 had been killed on the first day. This time, there were even more. A survivor later testified how a woman begged Viktors Arājs for mercy, only to be told, "Today, Jewish blood must flow." No photographs or film was ever taken of this event. But the Rumbula station master heard everything and later testified that the shooting finally stopped at 7:45 in the evening. Known as Bloody Sunday, it was the second largest single massacre of Jews in World War II. Over the course of 2 days, over 24,000 were killed and sardine-packed, including the mother, sister, and older brother of Margus Vestermanis. It took only 12 of Jekeln's men to shoot them, yet it required 1,500 Arajs Kommando to lead them to the killing grounds and stand guard. Margus Vestermanis and his father were spared because they were deemed fit for work, but it was stark consolation.
Un starp tiem Latvijas ebreju vīriešiem tāds briesmīgs izmisums, un kad nav tai dzīvībai, ja nav nekādas vērtības, kad ir bērni un sievietes un ģimenes ir iznīcināts, un tad sākās tā. Es vienmēr atcerējos ļoti labi latviešu slepkavniekus.
But Jekeln and the Arajs Kommando didn't stop at Riga. They turned their attention back to Liepāja. A ghetto had also been established there in June 1941. Now on the 13th of December, the Arajs Kommando began another roundup of Jews, locking them in the women's prison. The next day, they were marched to an old military training ground north of Liepāja, here at Skidje, where more trenches had been dug. Some German soldiers had traveled especially to witness this festival of killing. This series of photographs were taken by an SS officer. Groups of Jews were manhandled towards the trenches, where they were ordered to strip by the Arajs Kommando and Latvian police. Once naked, they were forced to the edge of the pits, where they were shot, this time by one of 3 units, one of Germans, one of Arajs Kommando, and one of Latvian police. Any that did not fall into the trench were pushed down by so-called kickers. Each trench was then covered. In 3 days, over 2,700 Jews were killed. The outlines of the trenches are still visible today. Liepāja had been cleansed. Now almost empty itself, the Riga ghetto was refilled with Jews from Germany. The ghetto had been divided with the surviving Latvian Jews living in one small corner.
Tagad mēs esam dzīvi tie, tā saucamais mazais geto, pretējā pusē ir no Vācijas atvestie, bet arī sievietes un bērni tur ir. Tā kā tiem vāciešiem tas ebreju darba spēks tā kā būtu vajadzīgs. Bet kā galu galā viņi mūs nogalinās, par ko to jau nebija nekādu šaubu.
Each time the ghetto became overcrowded, it was cleared out by the Arajs Kommando. On the 15th of March 1942, 1,900 German Jews were asked to volunteer for transfer to a fish canning factory. It was a joke that would have appealed to Friedrich Jekeln, the sardine packer. The Jews were loaded into Arajs Kommando trucks, driven here to the nearby Bika forest, and shot. The next day, over 1,800 more Jews were transported from the nearby Jungerhof concentration camp to the forest to join the dead from the Riga ghetto. With the help of the Arajs Kommando, the Nazis were hitting their targets in Latvia, and Walter Stahlecker kept meticulous records. He drew up this map and sent it to Berlin to satisfy them he was following orders. It was called the Coffin Map. The number of dead in Latvia now stood at 35,238. The total number killed so far by the Nazis in the Baltic states as a whole was almost 200,000. But across Europe, the Nazis were dissatisfied with the rate of killing. This document revealed the numbers of Jews in Europe still to be exterminated. So the Nazis changed their murderous strategy. They built death camps in Poland, where all the Jews of Europe could be brought and gassed in massive numbers. There was no longer a need for ghettos. Their occupants were loaded onto trains and taken to the death camps. At the beginning of the German occupation, there were roughly 90,000 Jews in Latvia. Just over a year later, only a few thousand remained. With no more Jews to kill, the Arajs Kommando became redundant. According to war crimes records, their numbers plummeted to 50 or 60. But for this loyal, hardcore group, there was more work to be done. On the Eastern Front, the German army was driving deep inside the Soviet Union. But for all their success, the Germans faced a new threat. It came from attacks from partisans, militiamen who sabotaged supply lines and ambushed German soldiers.
These Russian villagers, men and women, aye, and children too, fought an organized battle of wits, knowing well the certain penalty if caught, death.
The Nazis now sought help from a gang of men who were experienced at rooting out enemies of the state and executing them, the Arajs Kommando.
The mission of the Arajs Kommando changed to one of conducting anti-partisan operations. You could almost regard this as a euphemism for conducting reprisal actions.
The Arajs Kommando were posted to Belarus with a very clear mission.
Anywhere a German supply convoy or train had been blown up or derailed, or German troops coming up to reinforce the front had been shot at, the Arajs Kommando would go in and kill everyone in the nearest village and burn it down.
But the Nazis didn't just need thugs. They also needed soldiers, men to reinforce the Eastern Front. So they formed the Latvian Legion. Despite the propaganda, most Latvians had to be press-ganged into the Legion. But not the Arajs Kommando, who, still led by Viktors Arājs, volunteered and spearheaded one of the Legion's 2 divisions. Loyalty was cemented by the promise of a brighter future. The men were told, "You are fighting for a renewal of Latvian independence. You are fighting for freedom for your native Latvia. And after the victory of the Germans, it will become an independent state." The 2 divisions were given different objectives.
One part of the Latvian Legion remained in Latvia, and the other part of the Legion was transferred to Germany to rearm and re-equip and then be tossed back at the front.
As a reward for their service, the Arajs Kommando were spared the horrors of the Eastern Front and remained in Latvia. But the tide of the war was turning against Germany. By the autumn of 1944, the Red Army was retaking the ground it had lost to the Germans. Now in retreat, the noose was tightening around the Nazis' necks. On the 13th of October 1944, the Soviet army recaptured Riga. In the north of Latvia, the Latvian Legion with the Arajs Kommando fought the Soviets for over 6 months, but to no avail. Because further south, the Red Army made rapid progress into Germany and reached Berlin on the 20th of April 1945. The Third Reich's days were over.
Facing Air Chief Marshal Tedder and Marshal Zhukov is a conquered German general.
Only when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the German surrender in Berlin on the 9th of May 1945 did the Latvian Legion lay down its arms. At the end of the war, partisans emerged from their hideouts and conducted reprisals against collaborators all across the Baltic states. They would have been targets too, but Herbert Sukers and Viktors Arājs were nowhere to be found. In fact, Viktors Arājs had managed to escape to Copenhagen, which by then had been liberated by the British. Arājs now burned his papers, changed into civilian clothing, and surrendered to the Allied army, claiming to be just an ordinary soldier. But while in a prisoner of war camp, he was recognized by other Latvians and sent to a camp in Germany for former SS members.
A warrant for his arrest was duly issued by the court in Hamburg, but somehow Arājs had executed a baffling escape and was simply nowhere to be found in the camp when troops came to serve the warrant.
A hunt for Arājs was launched. Rumors spread that he had escaped to South America, or that he had even been recruited by British intelligence. In fact, cloaked beneath the chaos of post-war Germany, he'd simply melted away. And what of Arājs' trusted henchman, Herbert Sukers? Known as the Butcher of Riga, Sukers somehow found his way to Brazil in 1946. He settled in Sao Paulo and started a business running tourist flights and boat trips. There he remained, undiscovered, for almost 20 years. His flying business was doing well, and in 1965, Sukers took a telephone call from a new customer, an Austrian businessman who requested a short sightseeing flight. Sukers had no idea that Anton Kunzler, his customer, was not who he said he was, but an agent in the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad. Kunzler arranged a meeting with Sukers at the marina where his boat was moored.
Sukers was very suspicious all the time. I told him, I can take you for a flight around the Sao Paulo and see what's going on. And he said, okay, and they went for a short flight. And after this, Sukers was enough impressed by Anton Kunzler's hints that he's a businessman and he's looking for investors and he's looking for partners, etc. He invited him to have a drink on his small boat. And from this moment on, Tsukos started eating the bait that Künzler gave him.
After gaining Sucre's trust, Künzler lured his prey to the city of Montevideo in Uruguay. Waiting at a suburban house were other members of the Mossad team. The plan was to restrain Sucres, hold a brief trial, then kill him. But they hadn't counted on Sucre's will to live.
They were equipped with a gun with a silencer, a handgun with a silencer, which at the beginning didn't work. So the struggle was really physical struggle, you know. And as far as I understand, there was also a very heavy 5-kilo hammer involved in it. He said something in German, "Lass mich sprechen," yeah? Let me talk. But then the gun with the silencer came back to action, and they shot him twice in the head.
"11 days later, police entered the house. Inside, the body had been left in a trunk. On top was a folder. It contained a note that said Sucres had been condemned to death by those who will never forget. Sucres' assassination remains the only state-sponsored murder ever admitted to by Israel. Ten years later, the hunt for Viktors Arājs sprang back to life. In 1975, German police were told that Arājs had been found and assassinated by a Soviet hit squad.
The case was reopened because this seemed like definitely something that needed to be looked into. First off, it involved a murder. Second of all, it had international espionage implications.
In fact, Arājs was found alive and well and living in the German city of Frankfurt.
Prosecutors easily located Arājs very shortly thereafter, living under the laughably transparent alias of his own first name and his wife's maiden name, in what they called in the police documents a tumble-down attic apartment in Frankfurt, where he had been working as an apprentice printer, menial job in Frankfurt for 20 years.
After a 4.5-year trial in which Arājs initially would not speak and persistently claimed ill health, he was convicted of participating in the murder of at least 13,000 Jews. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but served just 9 years in Germany's Kassel prison before collapsing and dying from heart failure, age 78. The case of Latvia's worst Nazi collaborator was closed. Today, Latvia is still coming to terms with its past. In 1935, the Jewish population of Latvia had been just over 90,000. By the end of 1941, 75% had been exterminated. But before German occupation, the Latvian people had not been known to be anti-Semitic. To change the Latvians' view of Jews in their country, it took an extremely effective, coordinated, and concerted barrage of Nazi propaganda. It worked on a people who were already fiercely nationalistic. They were deceived into believing that the Jews had collaborated with their worst enemy, the Soviets, and had participated in mass murder. Viktors Arājs and his thuggish gang succumbed easily to this propaganda, but were also attracted by the violence and the prospect of easy money and endless vodka. As a token of reconciliation, memorials to the Holocaust have been built at Liepāja, Rumbula, Piekanieki, and the Riga ghetto.
Plaši ne tikai šaurākā ģimene, visi radinieki, visi paziņas, visa tā ebreju pasaule ir briesmīgā veidā gājusi bojā. Jā, tā ir trauma, ko es nesu praktiski visi ebreji nes caur visu dzīvi.
But these memorials are hidden away and not well publicized. They've also been desecrated. More disturbingly, groups like the Fatherland and Freedom Party still gather on Latvia Day each year to pay homage to those who fought alongside the Nazis, including the Arajs Kommando. The Holocaust in Latvia is still often denied, and until recently was not even taught in schools. Latvia has come a long way since the dark days of World War II, but it still has far to go to fully accept its role in the Holocaust.